Mad Mike here, and welcome back to the channel. So today I'm gonna do something I haven't done in a while. I did a top 10 list long, probably about 2 months ago. I wanted to do one again. Again, it's a slow news day, but it felt like something fun to do a video on. Um, but before we get to that, I would like to mention that Rated R Riffs is going to be coming on tonight as opposed to last night. We had technical difficulties, and we couldn't get the film to play on the site that we were using. So we found a new site. I think it'll work well for everybody, and hopefully we will have Cham, Vash, and Dakota on tonight to uh, watch Garbage Pail Kids. And if you would like to join us, feel free. If you have the movie, or if you know where you can watch it for free, or if you have it downloaded somewhere, pop it up and enjoy the film with us, or enjoy ripping it apart. So thank you for that. But now let's get to the actual video topic. And the actual video topic is my top 10 favorite movies of all time. Now, before I go into this, this is a personal list. This is not an objective list. If I was to make an objective list, it would be considerably different than this, although some of these films might be on it. So that's just a disclaimer at the beginning of this before we get started, just so people don't say, "Why do you have that on there? That's a shit movie." Um, so let's get on with this. So number 10 is Highlander. Now, for those people who don't remember Highlander, Highlander came out in the mid 80s, I believe it was 1985, and it starred Christopher Lambert in one of his first starring roles, as well as a now kind of older Sean Connery. I think this was post his James Bond days. I think the last one he did was in 1982. So this is past his James Bond, but it was kind of before he did stuff like Red October or Hunt for Red October, um, and it's really, really interesting to get these characters in there because they play such kind of over the top fantasy characters. And also, I can't forget Clancy Brown as the Kurgan. Almost totally steals the show. He steals the show in every scene that he's in, and I love Clancy Brown. Clancy Brown is one of my favorite actors, and he really, really hams it up in this movie. But the thing that makes the movie so good is that kind of sword and sorcery element to it, where for those of you who don't know the story of Highlander, I'm not going to give away too much just in case you haven't seen the film. Uh, Actually, it's screw it. Spoiler alert, for all of these films if you haven't seen them. But Christopher Lambert plays a character named Connor McLeod, who is basically, there are these beings in the world that are known as immortals. And basically, it means that he can't die unless he is decapitated by another immortal. So he can sustain any amount of injuries, get shot, get stabbed, anything like that, but he won't die unless he is decapitated by another immortal in combat. Now it doesn't say what happens if they just accidentally get decapitated, but basically Connor McLeod lives in 15th century Scotland, and he then finds out that he is one of these immortals because he is wounded in battle by Clancy Brown, the Kurgan, and he basically we go on this journey with Connor McLeod through this film, where it switches back and forth from 15th century Scotland to what was then modern day 1980s New York. And it's really, really interesting. The score for the movie is great. It was directed by a man who had mostly, I don't know why I can't remember the director's name, but he had mostly done music videos and stuff like that before this. And it kind of shows in the way that the choreography goes, but it works for the sword fights. And the sword fights in this movie are really, really good. Um, they're choreographed well, and the thing that kind of makes the conflict between Connor and the Kurgan so great is because Clancy Brown is just this towering figure. I don't know how tall he actually stands in real life. I'm sure they used some kind of perspective tricks when he's fighting Connor at the end of the film to show that how huge he is. But you legitimately think that he's going to kill him at various points during this movie just because of his sheer size. And again, he towers over everybody else in this film. He is so ominous, especially at the end of the film when he's totally lost his mind. There is a great scene where Clancy Brown has kidnapped Christopher Lambert's now girlfriend, quote unquote, Roxanne Hart, who's played by Roxanne Hart. And they're driving down the Brooklyn Bridge in New York to go to the area where the final confrontation is going to happen. And he starts singing New York, New York, which is coming on the radio being sung by Freddie Mercury. And it's also to note, Queen did an entire album for this film, and it shows. The album, which I believe is called Some Kind of Magic, is amazing, especially the opening song, Princes of the Universe. But back to what I was saying before, the scene is just amazing where Clancy Brown's just driving all over the road with a Cadillac. It's great. I love this movie. It's one of my favorite fantasy films. And honestly, even though Christopher Lambert has some issues because he's a Swedish man trying to play a Scottish person, it really does. The surrounding cast elevates him to a point where you don't even really notice that much. So that's my number 10. Love Highlander. Number 9 is a classic, and everybody should see this movie. It is hilarious, and that is Doctor Strangelove. Now, Doctor Strangelove is Stanley Kubrick's, I believe it was his fourth film or third. Came out in early 1964. Not long after the Kennedy assassination, and that actually played a part in some of the stuff that happened in the movie, where there were certain things going on. But the movie is essentially it's a dark comedy about nuclear holocaust, and it's very pertinent to the time. It deals with a lot of issues that were happening in America with the Cold War, but it's sprinkled in with this very subtle, blunt humor that was just so hilarious. Peter Sellers stars in this movie in three roles. He is Doctor Strangelove himself. He is President. I guess Hubert Humphrey is what they name him in this, and then he's also Colonel Mandrake, who is an RAF officer at the air base where all the bombers were sent out, and the base commander, General Jack D. Ripper, again a tongue-in-cheek reference to Jack the Ripper, has sent his planes out to bomb their targets inside Russia. And basically, the entire movie takes place over pretty much like a day, maybe 2 days, where they wind up. This base commander goes nuts because of. And they explain it in the movie. It's basically he thinks that the Russians are poisoning the water supply because he can't get his dick up, which is hilarious. But he sends all his planes to go attack Russia and basically rigs a system so that nobody can get in contact with them. And again, I'm not going to explain it in great detail because the movie does that for you. But it's one of those classic films that is so funny, and the more times you watch it, especially if you watch like a high definition version of it now, the more times you watch it, the more times you catch these little things that are so funny. George C. Scott as General Turgison does an amazing job with this film. He is chewing scenery. Now, supposedly there was actually a feud between him and Kubrick, because Kubrick wanted Scott to kind of go over the top. He wanted him to ham it up, and kind of be this larger than life type of character, which is what you see on screen. Scott, on the other hand, wanted to play it more low key, very deadpan, very serious, and Kubrick basically convinced Scott to do all these double takes where he would play the take one way. It was kind of like almost like a walkthrough, and he used those throwaway takes, quote unquote, to actually do the movie. And Scott found out afterwards and was so pissed that he never worked with Kubrick again and never wanted to. That's actually something that kind of happens every once in a while to Kubrick. But the movie was extremely pertinent for the time. And again, this is not long after the Kennedy assassination. The Cold War is still looming. There's a lot of insane shit that's going on in the United States in early 1964. And they actually had to change a couple of lines in the movie. There's a character, Colonel Kong, Colonel King Kong, again, another tongue-in-cheek reference, who's played by Slim Pickens. And he has a line where they're going through this little survival kit, which has all these, insane amount of stuff in it. And at the end of it, he says you can have a lot of fun in Vegas with all that stuff, but you can tell that there is a line that is being dubbed over his mouth. He actually said Dallas, but because the Kennedy assassination had happened in Dallas only about 3 or 4 months before the movie was actually supposed to be made, and after that scene was shot, or sorry, after the movie was supposed to premiere, but after that scene was shot, they actually had him dub over Vegas in post, but you can still read Dallas on his lips in the scene, which is kind of interesting. They also apparently cut a scene at the end of the film where a pie fight breaks out in the war room at the Pentagon, and Peter Sellers, as the president, is hit in the face with a pie, and George C. Scott has a line that says, "Our young president has been cut down in the prime of life," which obviously they deleted. And actually, it's probably good they deleted that scene. It probably would have been a little odd in the movie tonally. I don't think that would have made a whole lot of sense. But the movie is hilarious. Again, I would recommend watching it. I would recommend watching it a few times, because again, you miss a lot of stuff the first time through. It's one of those movies that you kind of find a little bit more every time you see it. But that's Doctor Strangelove. Again, I love that movie. That's my number 9. Number 8 is a 1980s classic from 1985, and that is Back to the Future. This movie had a development cycle from hell, and the fact that Robert Zemeckis actually got it made is amazing to me. I love Robert Zemeckis movies when you watch them because, for the most part, they're films that kind of they make you feel, they make you feel that kind of, I don't know what you want to call it, but it's kind of like movie magic. When you watch a movie and you're lost in it, that movie magic that Hollywood used to have a long time ago. His movies still have that. They have that childlike magic. And Back to the Future is one of those movies where you have all of these characters that come together, and all of them are so iconic. You have Michael J. Fox coming in as Marty McFly. You had Crispin Glover as George McFly. You had Leah Thompson as I can't remember the mother's name, but his mother. And then you had Lorraine McFly, and then you had can't remember the actor's name, but the guy that plays Biff Tannen. Of course, you had Christopher Lloyd as Doc Brown. There are so many characters in Back to the Future that are just so iconic, and even the things in the movie, the DeLorean time machine that they have, is so great. But and the companion pieces of Back to the Future Part 2 and 3 just add to what the first one did so right. But the funniest thing about the movie is that nobody wanted to make it. It was one of those films that in the early 80s, Robert Zemeckis shopped it around and nobody wanted to do it because they thought he was a shitty director, or they thought he made shitty movies, the movies that didn't make money. So nobody wanted to direct it, and he shelved it until he did Romancing the Stone with Michael Douglas and Kathleen Turner. And after that was a hit, then everybody wanted to make his next film, and he wanted to make Back to the Future, which is how that got made, because it was written by him and I believe also Bob Gale, who doubled as a producer. And the other thing that makes that movie so great is the score by Alan Silvestri. And the score that he does, again, it's almost like a John Williams score. Like when you hear an iconic John Williams score, you know immediately what it is. When you hear that bum 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 bum, like for Jaws, or you hear the Star Wars theme or Indiana Jones, you know immediately what you're watching. He did that for Back to the Future. The Back to the Future score is perfect, and it fits so well with the tone and the portions of the film. Uh, and honestly, I don't think he gets enough credit for that on a lot of levels. But the going through that movie, it's about your parents. It's about kind of whenever it's one of those things when you're a kid and your parents say, "I've been there too. I know what you're going through," and the kid never believes them because they always say like, "Oh, you're the parent. You don't get it. You were a kid, so many years ago," and then Back to the Future takes that idea kind of, but it puts the child back when the parent was a child, and they get to see that, yeah, they went through the same type of shit, and they get it. Uh, you know, Marty McFly at the beginning of Back to the Future he really has only a couple things going for him. He's really good at guitar, and he's really good at skateboarding. That's about it. He has no other things. He's friends with Doc Brown, who everybody thinks is a crackpot. He's late for school all the time. His girlfriend likes him, but nobody else does. His dad is essentially a bitch to his high school bully, Biff Tannen. Uh, you know, there's just so many problems with his family at the beginning, and then by the end of it, because he went back, and because even though he went back essentially by accident, because he goes back and changes a bunch of things, his life winds up being better because of that, but he also has a deeper understanding of his parents and what they went through beforehand. It's a family movie. That's essentially what it is. And then when you go further down the line, then you get into the deeper into the friendship between him and Doc Brown, and that sort of thing. But the first one I feel is very much a family movie of children and parents, and that's kind of how it's always worked out in my head. But I always love that first movie because you can pop that in, and it just makes you smile most of the time. It's so lighthearted, but it's so likable that it makes you smile, and that's why I love Back to the Future. Um, Now we're going to go down to a movie I actually just did a video on the other day, which I really enjoy, which is Demons. Now, Demons, which again I already did a video on it, so I'm just kind of going to glaze over this one a little bit. This will be shorter than the other ones. Um, Now, like I've said before, Demons was directed by Lamberto Bava, who's the son of Mario Bava. Mario Bava is the godfather. Essentially, he's the godfather, or the first big Italian horror director. And then it was also produced and co-written by Dario Argento, who is basically he's the best Italian horror director that has ever existed in the genre. So you have those two things going for you, and again, it shows very well. This movie accentuates everything that is great about Italian horror. The gore and the special effects are amazing. The story is great. It's almost a meta story in a lot of ways, where it's about a movie inside a movie almost, because it's these people going to a movie theater and they're going to see a movie about demons, and then demons start breaking out inside of the theater and killing people. Um, Again, it's kind of meta before meta was a thing, I guess is the best way to describe it. So when you go and do stuff like that, it it puts the audience in a bit of an interesting situation when they're watching, especially if you were watching this in a theater, because you're like, oh, they're in a theater, they're watching a movie, and the movie comes over into their theater. Then they movie skip. What happens if the movie skips again? It's kind of that subtle layer of terror that exists in it. Um, but again, it has those Italian horror tropes. All the dialogue is dubbed, obviously, but the dubbing is not terrible like some Italian horror films. It's very well made. The story again is very simplistic in the way that it goes about things, but you're just watching these people essentially try to survive inside this building. You don't know exactly what's going on. You never really find out. I mean, you know what causes the demons to come in, but you don't necessarily know like what the stipulations are, or why the movie theater itself is involved in the plot. You don't really understand that throughout most of the film, but you don't have to. And that again, that's the hallmark of really good Italian horror, is it's more abstract. You don't necessarily have to be as on the nose as you are with other types of filmmaking, because it's more the environment and the atmosphere and the visuals than it is necessarily the story and the cohesive elements. And again, it's not something that's for everybody, and the movie does have its problems, but it's one of my favorite films, and it got me into Italian horror, and I am a huge horror fan, and that movie opened up an entire genre of horror films that I have grown to very much love over the years. But Demons was the first one, and that was the one my favorite one out of Italian horror. So now we're going to go down to another one, which again would probably be on an objective list. Number six is Jaws from 1975, and I believe this was Spielberg's first theatrical release, because even though I also do love his film Duel was made for television. So Jaws is the first theatrical film that I believe Steven Spielberg made. I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. And the thing with Jaws is, again, this it is a miracle that this movie turned out as good as it is, especially the third act. And again, I think everybody knows the plot of Jaws. There's a tiny little island off the coast of, I believe it's Long Island, called Amity, and Amity gets invaded by this shark that starts killing people. And there's a whole kind of tug of war between Chief Brody, who's played by Roy Schneider, and the mayor of the city, who wants the beaches to be open because it's tourist season and it brings in a lot of money. And Roy Schneider is more concerned with the people of the island because there's a shark out there and it's killing people. And really, the opening scene of Jaws is what sets everything up for the rest of the movie. And it's this is a movie that had such historical significance. People were afraid to go in the water after this, and it's so you say it today as a funny kind of thing. Where we've seen a bunch of shark movies, we've seen Deep Blue Sea and all the Jaws sequels, and Megalodon and all that other crap, but this was the first in this kind of genre of shark film, and you never when people saw this, they were afraid to go to beaches, and ironically, a lot of tourist organizations suffered because of the film, but that's because Spielberg did such a good job at making you afraid of that shark in that film, because you don't really see a whole lot of it before the third act. You see a few little scenes where you get like a full body shot of the shark, but most of it is just it's a fin, or it's a pool of blood, or it's kind of like the camera angles from far away. There's a scene where basically kind of one of the catalysts of the film, where the shark attacks a little boy who's on an inflatable raft thing. He's out in the water, and you see the shark kind of come up and take him down, and then there's a bunch of blood and stuff, but you don't really see the shark because it's kind of the way the scene is shot. The camera is almost on the beach and it's zoomed into all these people, and the boy and the shark attack is in the very, very back. So you really don't see it very clearly, but that's what they wanted you to do. They wanted to keep it in the shadows for two reasons. Number one, because to show so much of it so early doesn't work very well, but also because the shark had terrible technical issues. And this is also why Steven Spielberg advised other directors years later never to film in the actual ocean. Try and film in a stable body of water, or film certain scenes on a sound set and then get B-roll footage get B-roll footage from the sea or something like that. Because even though the visuals in Jaws, especially the third act, are amazing, it was hell to shoot. Uh, but moving through that, you also have Richard Dreyfuss as the Hooper character, and again, he is amazing. Richard Dreyfuss does a very good job at playing basically a snarky asshole, and I really do love his character, and he fits so well in the third act when you have Chief Brody, who's played by Roy Schneider, Richard Dreyfuss as Hooper, and Robert Shaw as Quint. And when all three of those characters, it's such a great contrast because Quint and Hooper are essentially kind of almost they're very, very similar. The only difference is that Hooper he went the educational route as opposed to Quint, who went the fisherman route more or less. But it's so interesting. An extremely good scene that kind of shows everything. And also, as a side note, if you watch my other top 10 video, you know that I love Robert Shaw's Quint because he was, I believe, my number two favorite film character of all time. And this scene is actually in that video as well, where Quint is talking about the USS He was on the USS Indianapolis that sank, and and because it was on a secret mission to deliver the A bomb, a lot of those men were left in the water to fend for themselves for days because the mission was so secret that nobody knew that they had sank, and sharks killed a lot of the sailors. And this is kind of what Spielberg tried to do is he tried to tie Quint to a real life event even though he's a fictional character. And it resonated with people in 1975 because a lot of people back then, World War II was 30 years prior to it ended 30 years prior to that. So a lot of people that were going to see this who were, teenagers or stuff like that, their parents fought in World War II. So it ties a little bit of stuff closer to home in that respect. But Jaws is such an amazing film because it shows exactly why Spielberg is as good as he is. Because he can make you feel that kind of light. If he wants you to feel a certain way in a scene, he will make you feel a certain way in a scene. And he can do it. He can do it seamlessly. Where you can go from a scene where you are laughing your ass off to a scene where you are like, holy shit, what just happened? And that's sometimes what they do in Jaws. And he does a very good job at building up the tension in that movie. In addition to that, also because John Williams does the score, and the score to Jaws is another portion of it that really adds to that terror element, where you have that build up, that bump, 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 as it builds up to something happening. And that's really what makes that movie so scary in so many ways when you kind of first see it, is that you're not you that movie kind of ratchets everything up, so you're expecting something to happen but you don't know exactly what you think. Is the shark going to show up, what's going to happen? And there's a few kind of fake outs actually in the movie too, where it's kind of like, oh, you don't know if it's not the shark, or what's happening. Then you don't know what's going on. But Jaws is an amazing film. I love it. It is one of the I probably watched Jaws for the first time when I was about 10, but I've loved that movie for many years. Now, going down to number five, we get into what a film that is by my all-time favorite director, Ridley Scott, and that is Blade Runner from 1982. Now, Blade Runner, in my mind, is a very close to being a perfect film from a lot of aspects. The cinematography in that film is amazing. The visuals of the little ships they have, the spinners flying over this kind of industrial wasteland, it looks like, and you know just the visuals and the aesthetic scream sci-fi noir, and this is really kind of almost the purest form of it. Now, the movie itself follows Harrison Ford's character, who is Rick Deckard, and he is a retired Blade Runner who gets recruited back in to take out this group of four androids that have broken out. And basically, the whole idea is that these androids are not allowed on Earth. They have this little text crawl at the beginning that kind of explains all the context of the film, which they do. They used to do a lot in sci-fi movies back then, but it gives the audience a little bit of context without adding a shit ton to the movie. But the best part about this movie is that it shows two things. It shows that it's a message about humanity as a whole. What do we consider to be human? Especially with the character of Roy Batty, who's played by Rutger Hauer, where you look throughout the film, and even though these beings are artificial, they've been made by people, that they feel pain. They feel emotions. They love, they hate, all of this stuff. They've evolved in the very short time that they have been alive, and they basically the leader of the android manufacturing organization, Tyrell Corporation. Uh, he explains that the whole point, people evolve through memories, which is why androids have such a short lifespan, so that they can acquire those memories and gain sentience. But some of them, the newer ones, are learning faster and they're actually evolving. And it's the idea of, what is human? Is human something that's biological, or is human something that is universal? And, through that, we see that even though Deckard has his mission and he ends up completing it, at the same time, he falls in love with an android who has been given human memories in Rachel, who is played by Sean Young. And there's again, Rick Deckard was in my character list as well, with a specific scene where there's a scene where he finally consummates his relationship with Rachel. And the idea is he's trying to make her feel, because she now knows that she is a robot. She now knows that she, well, not a robot, but she now knows that she is, a artificial life form, and that she's been given somebody else's memories that are not her own. And essentially, this has caused her whole world to collapse on her, as it would any person or anybody that thought they were a person that you told that to. And Ridley Scott does a great job with, just the darkness and the lighting and some of the visuals in the film. There's a very great scene where Sean Young is on a piano and she's playing the piano, and there's these little tiny pictures, the old timey pictures, like 1800s to like 1940, 50-ish pictures that are all around this piano that she's playing, and she's looking at all these people, and presumably they're relatives of Rick Deckard, or old relatives, or ancestors, whatever. But it's such a very interesting visual where she's playing this beautiful song on there, but all these pictures are around her, people. They're almost like an audience watching her. It's so amazing the way that Ridley Scott kind of placed all those things around. Now, unfortunately, there was a feud on set between Harrison Ford and Ridley Scott that resulted in both of them never working with each other again, which is a shame, because Blade Runner, it was an amazing film. I would have loved to have seen Harrison Ford be in more Ridley Scott films. And it was also unfortunate that Blade Runner was a financial flop when it was released in 1982, mostly due to a very dishonest marketing campaign, where a lot of people thought this was going to be like a sci-fi romp, this was going to be like a Star Wars or something, where there was going to be a lot of action and things like that, and it's not. It's a very slow burn for a film, but it works for that because it's a noir film. It's a detective story, essentially, in a lot of ways, and it has the noir feel, and that's a slow burn is good for that kind of a movie. But people that were going to the movies were expecting something different because the advertising was not honest with them. Now, even though Ridley Scott and Ford did not work with each other again, they did put out a director's cut of the film that had some of Ford's input put into it. And I don't know. I personally prefer the theatrical version better. The director's cut takes out the voiceover elements, which I actually enjoyed. It felt a lot more, again, a lot more like a noir detective story with those, and I think that ultimately helps the film. This was also, I believe, the first role for Daryl Hannah, and I'm pretty sure actually it was her first role. She plays the character Pris, and it was also an early role for Edward James Olmos, who most people would remember going on to be in Battlestar Galactica and a whole host of other things. So, Blade Runner, amazing film. Now, next, number four, is a horror movie that I enjoy the hell out of, and it's from my favorite horror director, and that is John Carpenter's The Thing. And again, another film from 1982. Um, and The Thing is one of those movies where you can sit down and you can watch it, and it's one of those things. If you're squeamish, you're not going to like it. I know that for a fact, that if you're squeamish, you're not going to like it. But the movie is one of the best horror suspense films I have ever sat through. And I remember I sat through it for the first time because my father loves this movie, and I sat through it with him for the first time. I was probably like 12 or 13, and I just thought it was completely awesome. It was such an amazing movie. But the thing about the film is that Carpenter does this very good job of crafting an atmosphere where you don't know who's a thing, because the whole movie is about basically a thing that in kind of it absorbs people and copies them, and the whole point is that it wants to absorb all the life that it can and copy it. But it basically does that by hiding in plain sight. And they throughout the movie, the various characters find ways to kind of negate or kind of figure out who's the thing and who isn't. And in related to that, Kurt Russell does an amazing job as MacReady. Keith David does a very good job as Childs. Wilford Brimley is in this as the character Blair. Again, he does a great job. The supporting cast are all good. This movie is so great when it comes to the acting, the special effects, the music by Ennio Morricone, which again, Ennio Morricone is a legend. And if you don't know him, he is from the Clint Eastwood Dollars trilogy. And you've definitely heard his music somewhere, trust me. Um, but in The Thing, you never know who's a thing and who isn't. They give you some hints here and there, and there are some red herrings as well, because there's some characters you think, oh, he's definitely got to be infected, and then then he's not, then they're not. But it does such a good job at setting up that tense atmosphere where you don't know what's going to happen. And one of the best scenes in the film is the scene where Kurt Russell is doing the blood test, and he basically figures out through an earlier scene that if he thinks that if he harms one of the creatures, because it can kind of separate itself and do a bunch of stuff, because it's kind of like a mixture of smaller organisms, if he harms a little piece of the organism, it'll try and crawl away. Or in his words, something that's injured will crawl away from a hot needle. And he has a flamethrower, and he heats up this little wire, and he has everybody's blood in a petri dish. And he takes the wire and he puts it in the blood, and if nothing happens, then they're clean and they can be untied from whatever piece of furniture they happen to be tied to. So he does this, and you go through this, and you go through this, and you kind of expected, all right, maybe it's the last one who's going to test positive or something's going to happen. You don't know exactly what's going to happen. And he does it to one, and you can tell the reaction is almost visceral because you see it, and the blood literally just explodes out of the petri dish, and then the guy's blood that it is immediately starts transforming into what I can only describe as a human being with a Venus flytrap for a head. And it is so amazingly done. Again, the special effects in this film are phenomenal. They're unmatched. I can't remember the guy that did the special effects, damn it, but I wish I did right now. But The Thing is an all-time classic. It is a movie that has no equal in terms of practical special effects as far as I am concerned. There are some close seconds like the Evil Dead films and stuff like that, but as far as I'm concerned, The Thing takes the cake in many, many ways. So it's so great. And then the ending as well. The ending, it leaves it off on a note where like you still don't know, because it's just Kurt Russell and Keith David at the end of that film, and you don't know if one of them is a thing. You don't know if it's over, or if one of them is going to absorb the other one, or if something's going to happen, and then they just leave you on that. It is a great movie. It is a movie that does everything right from a horror aspect. It is a remake of a movie that came out in 1951 called The Thing from Another World, which I also enjoy for different reasons. But the John Carpenter version follows much, much more closely with the actual source material, which is a short story, I believe, from 1947 called Who Goes There? Um, but again, The Thing, amazing horror movie. It's a shame that it was destroyed upon its release. People called it horrible. People said that too much blood, too much gore, doesn't make any sense. The music is shitty. The acting is shitty. Why did anybody make this? And for all the people back then, I don't know what to think about that, just because it's so great. It almost boggles me that they sat through the same movie that I watched. But The Thing, an amazing film. And now we go down to number three. And number three is again a film by Ridley Scott, because I love Ridley Scott films, and that is Alien from 1979. Um, and Alien was one of those movies that pushed sci-fi to a new place that it hadn't been before. When you looked at Star Wars that had come out 2 years prior in '77, you saw kind of a cleaner version of space, a little bit, something like that. Star Wars was it was upbeat to a point. It was very fanciful and stuff like that. When you got to Alien, it was like the nitty gritty. It was like you were on the bottom of the barrel. Everything was dark. Everything looked grimy and wet. Everyone's sweating. There's gases and stuff leaking from various places in the ship. There's it feels dirty. The environment that you're in feels like it's dirty, and that it's almost like you're living in an old car engine. And they actually got that effect inside the Nostromo, the ship that's in the film, by I believe they went to an aircraft graveyard, which is essentially just a big vacant lot where they store aircraft that are going to get broken down and recycled. And they basically took all these aircraft parts and they took the hallways that they had built and they actually welded the aircraft. They cut them up and they welded pieces of them to the wall, so it kind of looks like you're almost walking through like a pipe tube, like just like an area that's made out of a bunch of pipes and other stuff like that. And it has an amazing environmental effect in the film when you're watching everything. And I can say a lot about Ridley Scott's directing. Again, impeccable. I love the way that he makes the characters feel so real. You can tell a lot of those scenes were somewhat improv. And actually, the one of the best scenes in the film, which is the scene where the alien chest burster comes through John Hurt's chest, is from what I understand, nobody was told that was going to happen. So the reactions that happened from the cast during that scene were completely real because they had no idea what was going to go down. Essentially, they knew there was going to be he was going to die or something, but they didn't necessarily know that he was going to have an alien thing pop through his chest and explode blood everywhere. Um, but that's why those reactions seem somewhat visceral when you watch the film. And again, the supporting cast is great. Tom Skerritt as Dallas is very good. Sigourney Weaver obviously leading the cast as Ripley. I believe it's Ian McDormand is the one that plays Ash, the android character. Yafet Kodo comes in as Parker as well. And also Harry Dean Stanton. And you have this kind of it's a very, very small cast. It's not very big, and you don't need it to be big, obviously, but it makes everything seem so much more personal when you're watching the film because there's so few people around. This takes place on a desolate world where the Nostromo essentially gets a distress signal that they go to a planet and they find this ship, and inside the ship, John Hurt's character finds these eggs, and one of the eggs opens up, and this thing comes out and attaches to his face. And again, you don't actually see the full grown alien until probably about almost 40 minutes into the film. It's probably 30 or 40 minutes because you see it when it's little when it comes out of John Hurt, but you don't see like the full version of it again until about 40 minutes into the film. And there are so many great scenes in Alien. It would take me 5 hours to go over all of them in detail, but one of my favorites is the scene where the Ash character is killed, or the Ash character is murdered. And the reason why it's so great is because it comes at the very, very end of the movie when you're not expecting anything to kind of change. You think that the character of Ash he has ulterior motives and stuff. You have no idea that he's an android. And then he just starts doing this stuff to people. He starts trying to kill people, and Yafet Kodo does a great job. He takes a fire extinguisher and knocks his fucking head off. And again, it's one of those moments where you're like, "Oh my God, what the hell just happened? Why is he leaking milk?" Again, none of it makes sense until they slow down and they start figuring out what's going on, and they kind of explain through dialogue that he's an android. But the scene where Dallas with the flamethrower is in the tunnels trying to kill the alien, that's another great one. That is a jump scare that is so earned because they're tracking the alien through the tunnels with these little devices. They look kind of like flashlights or with a little cone on the end, and they're tracking it and they're trying to tell Dallas while he's in the tunnels where it is and what it's doing, and he basically is going back and forth. He's going to try and kill it with the flamethrower. So he goes down. They're telling him he has to get out of there, telling him he has to move. And again, it's one of those scenes where everything's kind of ratcheted up to 11, and you have no idea what's going to happen. You don't know where the alien is. You don't see it, and they do such a great job because he goes down this little staircase from the top tunnel to the bottom tunnel. And as he goes down there, behind him is complete blackness, but you can't see anything. It's not like you can see like the shadow or the shape of the alien. You see nothing behind him, and that is great lighting. And he says something, and as soon as he turns around, he has the flamethrower flame that's at the end of the flamethrower. And as soon as he turns around, the flame lights up behind him, and you just see the alien stick its arms out, and then it cuts to black. And it cuts back, and they lose radio contact with him. It's one of the most frightening scenes just because you're not expecting it to be that abrupt. And Ridley Scott did an extremely good job of doing that in this film, where some things are extremely abrupt and you're not expecting them. They do the same thing at the end of the film with Sigourney Weaver in the escape pod. But Alien is, and I've heard it described this way before, and I agree with it, it's essentially the old Dark House story, but they put it in space. And they solve the problem of the old Dark House story of, okay, why doesn't everybody just leave the house? Well, if you're stranded on an alien planet in space and you can't leave the ship, then there's your problem. Or the problem is solved, essentially. So Alien does so many things right, and again, it's only added to it for the sequel Aliens in 1986. But the first one is still my favorite because of the way that it's shot and the way that it's done. So that's my number three. Number two, again, a film that would probably be on a list of all-time favorites, is Casablanca from 1942. Now, Humphrey Bogart is probably my favorite golden age of Hollywood actor in terms of all of his roles. I don't think I've ever sat down and watched a Humphrey Bogart movie and disliked it. He does great in all of his roles. I believe it's Ingrid Bergman who plays opposite him uh, as Ilsa, and again, she does an amazing job in her role. But the whole thing with Casablanca is that it's set in, I believe it's Morocco. I believe Casablanca's in Morocco, and it's World War II is raging. They're trying to get people out of Europe and through Morocco, but because the Nazis have taken France, they have also subjected authority onto all French territories. So the French territories in Morocco, specifically Casablanca, are under Nazi occupation essentially, and the Nazis do not want the Jews escaping. So that's kind of the back. That's almost like the B story, which is kind of what makes it great because it has an amazing. The backdrop itself would make an amazing film. It does drive the plot to an extent, but the main plot is the relationship between Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman, because uh, the the whole relationship with them is that they met in France. They were going to get married, and then she basically stood him up on a train out of town and said that she didn't want to see him again. And then you fast forward to the character of Rick, which again he was my number one favorite character of all movies, and he's sitting in his bar, and he's essentially he's shut himself off from the world. His heart has hardened. He doesn't really give a shit about anybody else other than himself. And he's been working with the French. He's been working with the Vichy French, who are in line with the Nazis. And it's only when she just happens to show up at the right bar at the right time that they kind of rekindle that. But he also finds out that her supposedly dead husband is not dead; he is alive. And this is when we kind of get into the plot line of they had even though they love each other, their romance was inevitably doomed. And throughout the movie, it's not one of those cliche Hollywood endings where the guy gets the girl. And that's what makes the movie so special. Is you watch this story and you think, oh, she's going to wind up with Humphrey Bogart. Of course she is. He's changed from the beginning of the movie to the end of the movie, where he's helping people and doing all this stuff now. And and but when you get to the end of the movie, it shows the complexity of his character, because he realizes that if she stays with him, she could wind up dead, or she's not going to have the best life that she could have if she stays with her now living husband. Because her husband, again, to make a long story short, her husband is essentially the leader of the Jew. He escaped from a concentration camp, and he's like a resistance leader, and a bunch of other stuff. So I mean, his role is important, and if he gets over to America, then he is going to need to then he is going to need her to support him. And Humphrey Bogart knows that, and he knows that's what's essentially that's what's best for her, and it's what's best for the majority of people. And that's why he eventually leaves, tells her that she needs to go. She needs to get on the plane. She needs to go to America, and she needs to get out of there. But again, going back, this movie has so many great lines. It has so many great moments from Humphrey Bogart. Again, I played this on my other video. Is Humphrey Bogart sitting in his bar after he meets Ingrid Bergman for the first time, or for the first time in Morocco since they split up in France, and he is just sitting there drinking himself silly. And I'm sorry, I can't remember the actor's name. The actor that plays Sam, his basically his best friend and the piano player at his bar. And it's a great back and forth between those two. You can tell that they legitimately care about each other. They're actual friends. It's more than just a business relationship, and like what they do for each other. And Sam is trying to make sure that he doesn't do something that's going to make him kill himself, essentially. He doesn't want him to just go and drink himself to death. He doesn't want him to get involved with her again because he knows what happened last time. And he's really just a caring friend, and he plays a great supporting actor in this, as well as the same guy that plays Louis, the leader of the French forces who's under the Nazis, who again comes full circle by the end of the movie and is basically against the Nazis and helps cover up Humphrey Bogart shooting one of them, and allows Audrey Hepburn and her husband to escape. So there are so many great moments in Casablanca, and it's directed so well. I actually personally consider it the best movie ever made objectively. But in terms of my list, it does come in at number two. But again, I love this movie. It is done so well. It handles itself so well, and the story is so universal that it can translate year to year to year, where it's just the story of lost love. And I think everybody can empathize with that, and that's why that movie is so good. Um, and now to go down to my number one, and my number one is probably going to make a lot of people scratch their heads, but I will clarify. My number one is Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan from 1982. And the reason why I will say this is because I have always been a huge original series Star Trek fan. I love the show. I love the films that came after it. I mean, obviously, since I'm listening, this is number one. But it was something that I shared with my dad because he had watched the show when he was a kid, when it was out in the 60s. And then later on, when I was young, he showed me the show and eventually showed me the movie. So it has an emotional connection with me, as well as just being a great science fiction film. And this is the thing: the original Star Trek movie that came out in 1979, Star Trek: The Motion Picture, was not very well received. A lot of people didn't like it. It was very boring. It was very drolly. They didn't really like a lot of the newer characters that were introduced. And it was basically kind of just a rip-off of an older Star Trek episode in terms of its plot. So when they did Wrath of Khan, they essentially gutted everything, and they brought in a director named Nicholas Meyer, who hadn't seen Star Trek before, and he actually had to go and watch the show and then devise a plot to come up with this new movie that they were going to do. And keep in mind, too, in Wrath of Khan, the budget was cut from the first film, so they were actually working with less money because the first film was not that successful. It did make money, but it was not as much of a moneymaker as they would have liked. Because, again, the only reason why the first Star Trek was greenlit was because of Star Wars in 1977. Because Paramount wanted to put their own film out there in order to rival Star Wars. So going into Wrath of Khan, it has its core ties are to the original series, but it doesn't go back to it too much. So it stars all the original cast. So you have William Shatner as Captain Kirk, you have Leonard Nimoy as Mr. Spock, DeForest Kelly as Dr. McCoy, uh, uh, Nicole Nichelle Nichols as Uhura, George Takei as Sulu, Walter Koenig as Chekhov, and so on and so forth. Oh, and James Doohan as Scotty, of course. And you have those cast members, but then they add in some new cast members as well. So you have Kirstie Alley coming in as Savik, who is a young Vulcan officer. You also have can't remember his first name. His last name is Barrett, who comes in as David, who is Captain Kirk's biological son. And the reason why I love this movie so much is because this is really more or less it's a movie about Captain Kirk. He is the centerpiece to this film, and a lot of the other stuff. Spock is very prevalent, but again, he's prevalent because it has so much to do with Captain Kirk. Because this is at the point where Captain Kirk thinks that he's over the hill. He thinks that he's done with the space stuff. He's getting older. He's supposed to be 49 in the film, and he's kind of he's they have a line where actually he's talking to Dr. McCoy, and Dr. McCoy says, "Everybody else has birthdays. Why do we have to treat yours like a funeral?" And it's such a great line from Nicholas Meyer because they do all this kind of build up to what is the end of the movie, where you kind of Captain Kirk is essentially kind of working through his own issues, and the idea of there's a bunch of themes in the film, deeper themes, but one of the main ones is the acceptance of death or the acceptance of loss. And that's something that Kirk has never been able to do in his life. He's never been able to accept that there is a quote unquote no win scenario. And he and because of that, he has been unable to grow as a human being, and that's really what we see over the course of the film, is that this new encounter with his old nemesis Khan has now allowed him to do that because of the sacrifice of Spock at the end of the movie. And it's such a perfect ending. It's such a bittersweet, perfect ending to that film, where everything is leading up to it. And there's so many great moments where it shows what Captain Kirk should be. And what Khan should be. And I will say this: Ricardo Montalban coming back as Khan for that movie was amazing, and I love him in that film. It's seamless from seeing him in the old original series to seeing him in Star Trek 2. It is seamless. He knows exactly how he needs to play the character, even though he's not in the movie for a large amount of time. I think he probably only has about 20 minutes of screen time, maybe, in the film. But he does a great job of just emphasizing how intelligent he is, how meticulous he is, and at the same time how brutal he is. And even though you see the aftermath of it sometimes, you don't necessarily see it being enacted live. It still carries so much weight with that character that you understand that there is a legitimate concern for the characters in the film. And again, that's realized at the end when they kill off a major character with Mr. Spock. But again, going through the film, it's essentially Kirk is facing his biggest challenge since since ever, basically, with Khan, because Khan has, over the course of the movie, he basically gains control of a starship called the USS Reliant, and they lure the Enterprise into a battle where they then attack them, and they're able to damage the Enterprise enough where they can't get away, but they manage to basically elude them for a while until the final battle. So the whole middle part of the movie is essentially a cat and mouse game, but it works very well because Kirk knows more about starships than Khan does. At the same time, Khan is smarter than Kirk in terms of his ability to learn and operate things. So he is going to learn faster, but Kirk has a larger, more accumulated knowledge. So that shows in the scene when it's a great scene when the Reliant and the Enterprise first meet. The Enterprise has no idea that the Reliant is under the command of Khan, and they're basically just giving them radio silence. Their shields aren't up, and Khan uses that and surprise attacks the Enterprise. He then decides, because he has an ego, and again, Kirk knows this. He's a military mind, and that's how it works. He knows the weaknesses of his enemies, and Khan's weakness has always been his ego in many ways. And Khan basically wants to see him grovel. He wants to see him beg, and he wants information on a weapon or a thing known as Genesis. And this is again a subplot in the movie where there's basically a device that creates planets or creates livable planets for people out of dead planets, moons, things like that. But Khan wants to use it as a weapon because it can also destroy planets. So it creates new life, but it also destroy any life that is on the planet if it is used for that. And this factors into Kirk's son and his estranged wife or girlfriend. I don't know. I don't think they never got married actually, but they are working on the project, which has how they get wrangled into the whole situation. But it's a great scene because Kirk knows that he can use the Enterprise's console to have the Reliant lower their shields, and Khan doesn't. And this results in kind of one of the better I gotcha moments in cinema history, where they lock their phasers and they manage to lower the shields, and they then damage the Reliant enough where it has to retreat. And again, it's a great scene. It shows the smarts of Kirk, the weaknesses of Khan, the character interactions are great. But again, the theme is what makes this movie. And other than the theme of loss, the other theme is kind of the idea of growing old and how that happens, and how you kind of when you get to that point where you think you might be over the hill, how you keep going. Because again, that's where Kirk is. His life is not something that he necessarily wanted. He's teaching cadets at the Starfleet Academy. He's not out in space doing his thing. He has his son is estranged from him. Really the only thing that he has going for him is his friendship with all his old crewmates, with Spock and McCoy and all the other characters. But the other scene in this movie that is great, and it is very well acted by William Shatner, is the Spock death scene, where Spock basically figures out Khan has activated the Genesis device, and it is going to explode, which is going to result in the destruction of both the Reliant and the Enterprise. And the Enterprise doesn't have enough engine power to get away. The only way to get it is to basically go into a room and fiddle around with a bunch of machinery, but the room is highly radioactive and nobody can go into it. So Mr. Spock decides to sacrifice himself and go into the chamber in order to fix the light speed drive so that they can get away. But in doing so, he is going to sacrifice himself. And at the last minute, Captain Kirk goes down after they've escaped the blast, and he's with Spock. But Spock comes in, and basically he's all messed up. The radiation's burned him. His skin's all messed up, and he's pretty much blind. His eyes are blind, and he walks up to the glass, and he has this very good speech. He has this amazing speech with Captain Kirk, where he goes and says that, he asks if the ship has been saved, and he says, "The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one." And he was doing what was right for everybody else so that everybody else could live. And Captain Kirk then realizes that that's the no-win scenario, and he has now gone through that no-win scenario because he is lost. Even though Khan was defeated, he has still lost something. And again, that's followed up by that great scene with the Mr. Spock funeral, where Captain Kirk gives that speech, talking about how Mr. Spock was the most human person he had ever met, even though he was an alien. And it's such a great movie and such a great ending. It's poetic. It's extremely poetic, and I could never think of a better way to make a Star Trek film than that. And then on top of that, just to end it off before you go into the credits, you have that monologue by Leonard Nimoy that's the original dialogue that was at the beginning of the Star Trek television series in the 60s. And then it ends where no man has gone before, and then you see the camera kind of fly through the stars, and then it goes to black, and you see the credits come up. It's so great. I love it. I love it to death. I've probably seen this movie over 200 times in my entire life, and I probably will see it thousands of times before I die. But I love this movie. It is such a great film. Probably the best on-screen acting job by William Shatner, period. And again, I love him in this film, as well as Leonard Nimoy, and the supporting cast does amazing jobs doing their stuff, even the new players. But it it just feels so good. And again, you also had James Horner coming in, a very young James Horner. I believe this wasn't his first film, but it was one of his first, where he actually did the music for it. And then obviously he would go on to do music for, he won Oscars for his composition later on, but he did music for Star Trek 2 and Star Trek 3. So it's really, really, really good. I couldn't recommend this higher for a watch, especially if you're a Star Trek fan. But this is my number one film of all time. And again, if you have stayed listening to this thing for the full hour, thank you very much. I'm glad you stayed on, and you could hear some of my opinions and why I love these films. And I hope if you haven't seen any of them, that maybe you'll pick some of them up, or give them a watch, because they are really, really good films. Um, but thank you again for listening. Uh, Hit the bell for notifications. Hit the like button. Subscribe. Leave any thoughts you have in the comments. Put your top 10. What are your top 10 movies? Uh, and remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?